إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So we're continuing with what the author is talking about tayammum and the times in which it's allowed to perform tayammum. So the first one that he mentioned was if a person doesn't have water or if they don't have enough water. So we talked on Tuesday about what to do if the person has no water at all. So today inshallah we'll finish talking about if the person has water but it isn't enough to perform tahara. So if they're carrying water with them and they're traveling or whatever the case is, and they have some water but it isn't enough to complete a full wudhû, or they're upon janâbah and it's not enough to water to complete the full ghusl. So in this topic, because there isn't a clear text from the Quran or the Sunnah that says this is what you do when you have some water but not enough, the ulama differed on what to do, because they would interpret the ayat and the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ in different ways in order to reach the ruling that they found to be the strongest. So the first opinion on what to do in this situation is that the person wouldn't use any of the water, and then they would only perform tayammum. So they wouldn't use the water to do part of their wudhu or anything like this. They would just go straight to tayammum and leave that water for themselves for later on or whatever the case is. And that's the opinion of the Ahnâf and the Mâlikiyyah and Imam Ash-Shâfi'î in his old opinion, and Imam Al-Muzanî from the Shâfi'iyyah. So the majority hold this opinion that you would leave the water that you have, you wouldn't use any of it, and you'd go straight to tayammum. And the evidence that they use for this is the verse that we talked about last time about the tayammum. And the way they interpret this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began the verse by saying, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَرُجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began the verse by saying, O you who believe, if you stand up for the salat, then wash your faces and your arms up to the elbows, and wipe your heads and wash your feet up to the ankles. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continued and said, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ جُنُبًا فَطَّهَّرُوا. Or if you're upon janâbah, then perform tahara or purify yourselves. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ مَرْضَى أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ أَوْ جَاءَ أَحَدٌ مِّنْكُمْ مِنَ الْغَائِطِ أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned some of the reasons why someone would, that if you're traveling, or if you're sick, or you're traveling, or if one of you has come from relieving himself, or you have had intercourse, and you find no water, فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. And if you find no water, then perform tayammum with pure sa'id, which is, we'll talk about what that is, but for now we'll just use the word soil. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned one of two things. Either you perform wudhu or ghusl, depending on your situation, or if you don't do that, then you perform tayammum. So there's nothing in between. Either we do this or we do this. So we know that, what they say is that if we use the water, then we haven't done what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to do, because we can't wash everything that we need to. So then if we wash, say, our faces and our arms, and then we don't have enough water anymore, and then we say, well, this was enough because we did what we needed to do. Well, it wasn't, because we didn't complete what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to do. So now at this point we're not on wudhu and we have to perform tayammum anyway. So they say we join between two different things instead of only performing one. Also what they say is that this verse, even though it says that you find no water, what really is meant is that you don't have enough water to do what you need to do. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us to do these things, wash our faces and our hands to the end of that part of the verse, Then after explanation said, if you don't find water. So meaning if you don't find water, to do what you were told to do. Likewise, if someone had water, but they were going to go thirsty without it, we would say, yes, they have water, but they don't have the water that they need to perform wudhû or ghusl. Or if the water was najas, so there was enough najasa in it now for us to say that it's najas, would we say, well, you do have water, so you have to perform it? No, we would say, you go on to tayammum, because even though technically there is some water there with you, it's not sufficient for you to do what you need to do at the beginning of the verse. So we go to the replacement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us. Likewise, they say that someone might say, well, wouldn't we do what we can with the water, because we're only held accountable for what we can do? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, and obey Allah, and fear Allah as much as you're able. And then the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said from Abu Hurairah, إِذَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, or if I command you with something, then do as much of it you can. وَإِذَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ شَيْءٍ فَانْتَهُوا, and if I forbid you of something, then leave it. Someone might say, well, we're able to do part of the wudhu, then we would do part of the wudhu, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us to do what we're able, and the Prophet ﷺ told us to do what we're able. However, what we would say is, what would we say about someone who is able to fast part of the day during Ramadan? They can't go a whole day, they can't go say 12 hours of fasting because they'll get sick, but they can do 7 hours. Would we say, well, now it's obligatory upon you to do 7 hours of the day and the rest falls off of you? No, we would say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a replacement for what we do. If we can't do this, we do this. So likewise in this case, we can't perform our wudhu, so we go to the tayammum. Even though we can do part of the wudhu is either all there or not all there. Likewise with fasting, you can't fast part of the day and say, well, I did part of the day, that counts for some of the reward, and I can make up the rest of the time. Tomorrow I'll fast from 4 to 8, and today, because today I did from 8 to 4. No, it doesn't work like that. It's either the full act of worship, or it's part, or it's none. So what they say is like that. Likewise here, yes, we have some water to do what we need to do, but it really in the end, it doesn't fulfill that ibadah, so it doesn't really count. So this is the first opinion, as we said, is the majority. The second opinion is that you would use the water, and then you would perform tayammum for the rest. So for example, you would take the water, you would wash your face, and you would wash your arms, and then say you ran out of water, then you would perform tayammum to make up for what you weren't able to do. And the reason for that is they say, well, we had to perform what we needed to, because we had some water, but then it wasn't enough, so now we're not on tahara, and we have no water, now we have to perform tayammum. And this is the opinion of Imam Ash-Shâfi'î rahimahullah in his new opinion, and Imam Ibn Hazm from the Zahiriyyah, and the Hanâbilah as well. So what they say is like we just said. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, obey or fear Allah as much as you're able. We're able to do this, part of the wudhu, so we have to do it. We're able to, and the Prophet ﷺ said, if I command you with something, like we mentioned this hadith, so we're able to do part of it, then we have to do what we're able. But then, this is their argument, and we come back and we say, but again, like we said, we wouldn't say you have to do part of the day in Ramadan, because it doesn't count as anything. We wouldn't say, for example, if someone had made an oath, and we know that one of the parts of the kafara or the expiation for an oath or broken oath is that you feed 10 people. We wouldn't say that if he's able to feed 10 people, only 9, that he has to do 9, because it doesn't fulfill what we have to do. It doesn't cancel out what we need to do. What we'd say is he's not able to do that, so he goes on to fasting 3 days. So just because someone is able to do part, many times in the Sharia, if it doesn't cover the whole ibadah, then we go on to the replacement, or what we call the badal, or the thing that takes the place of the original ruling. So this is the arguments that they make. They also say that there is a precedent in the Sharia to do part of an ibadah. So what's something, if you think back specifically even in Tahara, so those who were present, there's certain times where a whole ibadah or a whole tahara is required, but part of it is sufficient. So we talked about this before. It was in the chapters of ghusl. It has to do with janâbah. When's the time where you,
what's it called? When you want to go to sleep?
Exactly. So what do you do?
Just wash your private areas and make wudhu.
And make wudhu, right. So even though we would say you're not supposed to sleep on janâbah, there's an exception to it where even though you didn't perform the whole ghusl, you perform wudhu and then you can sleep. So they say, well, so here we have a precedent where you need to do the whole thing, but you do part of it and that's enough. But the reply to this is we say, we have a text for this from the Prophet ﷺ. He told us to do this at a certain time. We don't have anything where the Prophet ﷺ told us, do part of your wudhu and do tayammum for the rest. So that's one thing. Secondly, what's the ruling on being on wudhu for the salat? It's wajib. What's the ruling on, and we talked about before, sleeping upon janâbah without performing wudhu? Some say it's haram, some say it's what? It's disliked. So even if we say that it was haram, it's not, the validity of there's no validity of sleep where we say, well, if you're not on wudu, your sleep doesn't count. It doesn't really have it doesn't have that same level, as opposed to salat. You have to be upon wudu, otherwise it's invalid. Likewise, there's a consensus that if you're not on wudu, then your salat is invalid. But there's a big dispute on whether you have to perform wudu if you're on janâbah. So we would say, even if we said it was haram to sleep on janâbah without performing wudu, they're not at the same level for us to say, well, we have this in the Sharia, and this goes back to what Sheikh Harith talked about before in the Usul al-Fiqh classes, when he talked about the qiyas. So if we're going to make qiyas, then we can't make qiyas for those who accept it in this type of thing. We wouldn't say, well, here's something where it's recommended to perform wudu before you sleep. So we can use this as evidence on what to do in a situation where something is wajib by consensus, because they're two different things. So we can't make that analogy between the two things. They also say that, like we said, for this first opinion, that we either have wudhu or tayammum. We don't have anything where we do both, where we do the asl and we do the badal, where the thing that replaces it. They say, well, no, we do have something like this, which is when you wipe on your khuf. They say, well, this is you're combining between the asl, which is washing, and the fara', the badal, which is wiping. But what's the problem with this argument? Exactly. So the first thing is we have the text. Second, if someone said, well, no, we know we don't have a text, but we're doing qiyas here, what's an argument against that here?
In the wudu, when you're wiping off your socks, you're not then taking them off to wash your feet. You're just doing one or the other.
Exactly. So even though we are washing in the wudu, the wiping on the khuf didn't take the place of the whole wudu, and so we're washing our arms and wiping our khuf. We either wash our feet or we wipe the khuf or the shoe or whatever. We don't ever do both. So that argument falls apart when they use it that way. Others from the ulama, they say we differentiate between ghusl and wudhu. So they'll say, and we talked about this in ghusl, what's the ruling on performing ghusl, doing part of the ghusl in one time and then finishing it later on?
Not allowed.
But I mean, let's say I went and someone, they washed their upper body, so they made ghusl for the first half of their body, and then they went, and then they came back and they did the bottom half of their body. Would this count or would it not count, according to the stronger opinions?
Depends on the time.
Some say it depends on the time. Some say it's okay in general. So the muwalat or the close sequence in ghusl isn't a requirement. But we know with wudu, the stronger opinion is that it is. You can't wash your face and your arms and then come clean the masjid and go back and wipe your head and wash your feet. That wouldn't count. But with ghusl, if you did part of it and then the other part later on, this is correct because there's no evidence to say it has to be all done right beside each other. So they say, some differentiate and they say, well, if, for example, with wudu, if we only had part of the water, it's pointless, because if we got the other part later on, we have to start the wudu over again, as opposed to ghusl. If I had a little bit of water and I wanted to remove my janâbah, I have to use it to do what I can, and then I perform tayammum with the rest. And Allahu Alam, this is, it's like we said before, it's a qiyas when it's not needed. We have texts from the Quran that tell us this or this. Tayammum is valid if we can't do the whole thing. So inshallah, so from this we see that the stronger opinion is that if the person doesn't have enough water to fulfill their whole wudu or their whole ghusl, then they would go straight to tayammum. So the stronger opinion is that of the Ahnâf and the Mâlikiyyah and some of the Shâfi'iyyah, because it complies with the texts of the Quran, and it doesn't have any sort of logical inconsistencies when we talk about this. Yeah.
So, if a person had enough water to do it, but they were, for example, in a desert or something, and they could have died from thirst, then would they also do the same thing? They'd perform tayammum and use the water for drinking?
For sure, yeah. Because then there's even more of a reason, right? Because they don't have enough to do it, plus they need it to live. But we're saying, even if you didn't need it to live, like let's say you knew, okay, well in 5 hours, like I can go 5 hours without drinking water, and the water truck or the water is going to be turned back on in 5 hours. I can wait to drink now, but I can't wait to make wudu because I have to pray. In that situation, we would say the strongest thing is that you'd perform tayammum. You don't have to use any of the water that you have, and that would be sufficient. And there's other opinions on the topic as well, like there's some narrations from some of the tabi'een, from Al-Hasan, Al-Basri and Atâ, that they say you perform wudu even if it's not enough, and then that's enough. Allahu Alam, again, like we said, we have a text that if you're not on wudu, you have to perform you have to be on wudu or some sort of tahara for the salat. If your wudu was invalid because you didn't finish it, now you have to perform tayammum because you're still not on any sort of tahara. So Allahu Alam, this is, if it's confirmed from these tabi'een, then it wouldn't be acceptable because it goes against the Quran. Next, so we'll leave that. And one more thing that I'll mention is, what if the person has enough water? Say they have a najasa on their body, and they have enough water. They can either remove the najasa or they can perform wudu. So they have to make a choice now. Do I remove the najasa and then make tayammum, or do I leave the najasa and perform wudu because I have enough to perform wudu? So on this topic, there's really only two opinions. So the first is that you'd have to remove the najasa and then you'd perform tayammum, and that's the opinion of Ahnâf, Shâfi'iyyah and Hanâbilah. Second opinion is that you would perform wudu and you would leave the najasa on you, and that's the opinion of Abu Yusuf al-Ansari, like we said, from the Imams of the Ahnâf and some of the Mâlikiyyah. And with this, really there's no text, but what we say is that there's a consensus, like we said, that being on wudu is a condition for salat to be accepted to begin with. When it comes to removing najasa, no one has ever said that it's a condition. Or some say it's a condition, but some say it's only wajib, and some say it's mustahab. The Malikiyyah, the Zahir, or the what seems to be what they say, is that even if you have najasa on your body, your salat is accepted. It's just better for you to remove it. So in this case, we would say that there's, we would do what's more important, which is the wudu, and inshallah the part that was, less important, which is the removal of the najasa, we would say inshallah this is something that would be excused because the person didn't have enough water to remove what he needed to. Likewise, you can't perform wudu except with anything except water. You can remove najasa with anything. You can use dirt, you can use a rock, you could use, like, if you had some other liquid thing. So there are other options for removing najasa, but there's no other option for performing wudu. There's only one liquid that you can perform wudu with, and obviously that's water. So this is the end of the discussion on the use or the lack of water, whether it's complete lack or a partial lack of water. Next, the author goes into if someone is injured. So he says, so he's talking about the times when it's allowed. He says one is injured or ill. If one is in this condition and believes that water will worsen it, so meaning his sickness or his injury, if he's worried that it'll make him cold, or if he gets water in that injury, or that that part, his cut or whatever, it's going to maybe lead to an infection or something like this. And then it says he does not have to be absolutely sure, but he may base his opinion on past experience or what a knowledgeable person has told him. He may perform tayammum. So what he's saying here is that you don't have to know 100% that it's going to be like this. If, for example, you had a cut on your hand before and you performed wudhû and then that led to an infection, you can use that as an assumption that, okay, it's probably going to happen this time. Maybe it won't. We don't know for sure. But based on experience, okay, the water here for whatever reason, maybe it's dirty and I'm going to get an infection. Or last time I performed wudhû at Fajr at this time, I got really cold and I got pneumonia, or whatever the case is. This is sufficient. Or if a knowledgeable person, so maybe someone who's a doctor, someone who maybe experienced that same thing in the past, if they tell you that, so the author here is saying that would be sufficient for the person to be able to perform tayammum. So for this he mentions the evidence. So the first thing, or the main evidence he mentions is the hadith from Jabir radiallahu anhu that he said, خرجنا في سفر فأصاب رجلا منا حجر فشجه في رأسه, or that we went out on a journey and a man from us got injured after he was hit in the head with a rock. And then it says ثم احتلم فسأل أصحابه, or then he had a wet dream and then so he asked his companions, so the people who were with him, هل تجدون في رخصة في التيمم, or do you see that I have an excuse to make or permission to make tayammum? قالوا ما نجد لك رخصة وأنت تقدر على الماء, or they said, we don't find that you have any excuse or any permission while you're able to use water. So there's water there, so there's no reason for you not to be using it. فاغتسل فمات فلما قدمنا على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أخبر بذلك فقال, or then he said, so he performed ghusl and then he died. So Jabir radiallahu anhu says, so when we came back to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he was informed of that. So he's informed of what happened to the man. So he said, قتلوه قتلهم الله ألا سألوا إذا لم يعلموا فإنما شفاء العي السؤال. Or he said, or what's attributed to him that he said, they killed him, may Allah kill them. Why did they not ask if they didn't know? Because indeed the cure for ignorance is asking. إنما كان يكفيه أن يتيمم ويعصر أو يعصب على جرحه ثم يمسح عليه ويغسل سائر جسده, or سائر جسده. Or so then the Prophet ﷺ has attributed to him that he said, it would have been sufficient for him to perform tayammum and to wrap around his wound something, and then to drop water on it, and then to wash the rest of his body. So meaning that he didn't need to do the whole thing, but he could have put a little bit of water around the wound, wrapped it, and wiped upon it after performing tayammum, and then washed the rest of his body. And that would have been sufficient for his ghusl. Then the author says this is related by Abu Dawood, Ibn Majah, Ad-Daraqutni, and Ibn As-Sakan, and he said that it's sahih. So he's using this hadith to show that illness is an excuse for performing tayammum. But this hadith itself, even though he mentioned someone who authenticated it, was rejected by Imam Ad-Daraqutni and Ibn Abi Dawood and Ibn Hajar and others. So the more knowledgeable scholars of hadith and the vast majority of them rejected this hadith, this story about this man. And other narrations of the same hadith were rejected by Al-Bukhari and Ibn Adi and Abu Nu'aym and Al-Bayhaqi and others. So this story isn't confirmed from the Prophet ﷺ, not his statement, nor the story that goes with it about this man having this injury and dying. However, we have the ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِن كُنْتُم مَرْضَى, or if you're ill. So right in the beginning of the ayah, or in the beginning of the part of tayammum, He mentions illness. So, despite this, the ulama differed on, or some differed on whether you can perform tayammum or not when you're sick. And the reason for this is, if we look at the verse itself, so what does it say? If you're ill, or when kuntum marda aw ala safar, or you're traveling, and it mentions another, and it says, and you don't find any water. So some interpret it as saying that if you're ill and don't have any water, or if you're traveling and don't have any water, then this is when you can perform tayammum. But having water, being sick and having water, they say you don't fall under this part of the verse. And Allahu Alam, again, this is attributed to Atâ and Al-Hasan al-Basri from the Tabi'een, but it's not really confirmed from them. So many people would say, well, this was their opinion, but the ulama who would look into these things, they said they can't find any real authentic attribution to these Tabi'een that they said this. And in fact, there's a narration from Al-Hasan al-Basri where he actually said the opposite. Other than this, everyone else has said that it's allowed if you're sick to perform tayammum. The only difference is, well then, what's considered the illness that we can do it? Because this is obviously a big thing. Someone might say, well no, the only time you might be able to do it is if you have an illness that's going to kill you. Others might say, well no, if you're cold, if you have a cold, this is something as well, because technically they're both an illness. So this is something that's important, because we can't take something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us permission for and then restrict it without evidence. But likewise, we can't take something, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us permission for a certain thing, we can't then expand it and start doing it in places where it's not allowed as well. So this is, inshallah, what we'll talk about now. So, like we said, everyone else said that you're allowed to do it, to the point where many claimed that there's a consensus that you're allowed. The first opinion is that any time a person is sick and performing wudhû will make a hardship for them, then this is all that's needed in order to perform tayammum. So meaning it doesn't have to make you more sick, it doesn't have to kill you, it doesn't have to prolong your illness, but if linguistically you're sick or ill, and by you performing wudhû it's going to make a hardship for you, then this would be sufficient for you to perform tayammum. And this is the opinion of the Zahiriyyah. So what they say is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, when kuntum marda aw ala safar, or if you're ill or upon a travel, what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? What type of illness did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specify? None. So if we're going to say that it's a certain type, we need either evidence from the Quran or Sunnah to say, well, it's only this type of illness, or we say, if you're ill. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, if you're ill. If we come and say, well, no, it's not any kind of illness, we need an evidence from the Quran or the Sunnah to restrict Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words to a certain type. But they restrict it to a hardship based on the end of the ayah. So if we go through the whole ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِن كُنْتُم مَرْضَى أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ أَوْ جَاءَ أَحَدٌ مِّنْكُم مِّنَ الْغَائِطِ أَوْ لَمَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned if you're sick, and then right at the end Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, مَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيَجْعَلَ عَلَيْكُم مِّنْ حَرَجٍ. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, after mentioning the ahkam of tayammum, Allah does not want to place any hardship on you. وَلَكِنْ يُرِيدُ لِيُطَهِّرَكُمْ وَلِيُتِمَّ نِعْمَتَهُ عَلَيْكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Allah does not want to place any ill or hardship upon you, rather He wants to purify you and complete His favor or His virtue upon you so that you may be thankful. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, if you're sick, this is what you can do. Allah doesn't want to make a hardship on you. So this is what they say, if we stick to this verse, this is what we have. And they say we have nothing in the Quran or the Sunnah to tell us what type of illness. It doesn't say if it's a death, an illness that's a terminal illness. It doesn't say long-term versus short-term. It doesn't say, physical, like something, an injury as opposed to like a virus. None of this is mentioned in the Quran or the Sunnah. So they say, like we talked about many times before, we stick to the evidence. We can't restrict something that's general, and we can't make something general if it's restricted in the Quran or the Sunnah. The second opinion is they say that if using the water is going to make the illness worse or delay the recovery, so instead of, let's say, for example, a cut's going to take, if you don't perform wudhu, your injury will take 3 weeks to heal, but if you perform wudhu, it's going to take 9 weeks. This, they would say that it would be allowed. Or, for example, now it's just an injury, but if you perform wudhu, now you're going to get an infection and it's going to make things worse. Then they say this would be a time when it's allowed. And this is the opinion of the majority. So the Ahnâf and the majority of the Mâlikiyyah and one of the opinions of the Shâfi'iyyah, they say that it depends on things taking longer to heal or illness getting worse. What they say is that, yes, the verse was general, but we can't give it its absoluteness or say that it's in general because people might take advantage of it. And they say because in the Sharia, we're obligated to protect ourselves. We can't, a person can't just go and cut their finger off and hurt themselves in that way, or start, taking poison, or, you're obligated to protect yourself, your body, your mind, and so on. So they say that this would be the restricting factor on the verse, would be that we're obligated to protect our limbs and the integrity of our body and so on. The next opinion is they say that if the person fears death, they can perform tayammum, otherwise they can't. So even if you thought the illness was going to get worse or was going to take longer to heal, you'd have to perform wudhu. The only time that it would be an exception would be that that the person was going to die from it. And this is it's attributed to Imam Malik rahimahullah, and it's a narration from Imam Ahmad, and some of the Shâfi'iyyah hold this opinion. What they say is that we have the illness, and then we restrict it based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا تُلْقُوا بِأَيْدِيكُمْ إِلَى التَّهْلُكَةِ, or and do not throw yourselves into destruction. And that's from Al-Baqarah 195. And then they also mention the verse, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا, or and do not kill yourselves, indeed Allah is merciful, will be merciful to you. And that's from Surah An-Nisa, verse 29. So they say we have these two evidences that show that we're not allowed to kill ourselves or do something that's going to lead to our death, with obvious exceptions in the Sharia. But they say, well, this shows us that that there's that this is the restriction, because they say, well, that means that if we say someone has a cold, they can perform tayammum, even though it has no effect. So we need to restrict it some way. Then they mention a hadith. They mention the same hadith that we just talked about the man who had died. So they say, well, this shows that he should have performed tayammum, so it's a restricting factor. And then the last thing that they mention is the famous hadith from Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu, that he said, احتلمت في ليلة باردة في غزوة ذات السلاسل, or he said, I had a wet dream on a very cold night during the battle of ذات السلاسل. فأشفقت إن اغتسلت أن أهلك فتيممت ثم صليت بأصحابي الصبح, or that he said that he became afraid that if he performed ghusl that he might die. So he performed tayammum, and then he led his companions in Salat al-Fajr. Then he said, فذكروا ذلك للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال يا عمر صليت بأصحابك وأنت جنب, or he said, they mentioned this to the Prophet ﷺ, so he said, O Amr, did you pray or you lead your companions in prayer while you were upon Janâbah? So he said, فأخبرته بالذي منعني من الاغتسال, or he said, I told the Prophet ﷺ about the thing that stopped me from performing ghusl. وقلت إني سمعت الله يقول, or he said, and I heard Allah saying, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا, or and do not kill yourselves, indeed Allah is merciful to you. فَضَحِكَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ وَلَمْ يَقُلْ شَيْئًا. Or the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned this verse, so the Prophet ﷺ laughed and didn't say anything. So they say that this was the understanding of the Sahabi, that because he felt that he might die, then he was able to perform tayammum. What's these opinions about it being about protecting your body and about not killing yourself? What's a problem in the usage of the evidence that they're using? If I say you can perform tayammum if you think you're going to die, does that mean that you can never do it with anything else? Or does it mean, well, this is one of the times that you can do it?
This is
one of the times. So just because the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell Amr, this was the only time you were allowed, or there's no evidence that says only do it if you feel you're going to die. We know you can do it if you're going to die. No one's disputing that. But does that mean because you can do it if you think you're going to die, you can't do it if you think you're going to lose your arm? No, it's not evidence for that. It doesn't prove that. Likewise, if you think it's going to get worse, does that mean you can only do it if you think it's going to get worse or take longer? Or could it be that if it's going to be a very big hardship on you, it's also another time you can do it? It could be, because just because we affirm one thing, it doesn't mean everything less than it is rejected. So just because, like if we say that, for example, if we said that a person can wipe on the khuf, does it mean he can't wipe on anything else? No, because we have evidence for that as well. So we don't say that just because one thing is mentioned, everything else other than it is wrong. We say, well, this is one of the types, just like we'll talk about when we get into what can you use for tayammum. We have evidence that you can use soil, like fertile soil, something that you would plant a plant in, or plant a tree or crops. Does this mean anything other than soil that can be used for planting crops is invalid? No, because all we know is, well, this is one type, and we use the evidence to show that the other types would be valid as well. This is on top of the fact that both of these ahadith, they're weak. So the first one we talked about, it was weakened by the vast majority. The second hadith, which is the one about Amr ibn al-As, it's weak as well. It was narrated by Ahmad, Abu Dawood, Al-Hakim, Ad-Daraqutni, Ibn Hibban, and Al-Bukhari mentioned it in mu'allaq form, like we talked about before. All of the chains of this hadith are weak. Either there's a break in the chain, or there's a weak narrator, or there's other defects about ittirab, or that in one time there's a person missing, in another chain he's there, which we don't need to get into the sciences of the hadith. But if we look at all the chains of this hadith, they've all been weakened by ulama at one time or another. From them were Imam Ahmad, and Imam al-Bukhari, and Imam al-Tabarani, and Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, and others. So if we look at this, what we have is that the verse permits tayammum when you're ill. No one disputes that. Do we have anything that restricts it? No. We don't have any evidence to say it's only allowed if you're going to die, because there's no evidence for that. Even the evidence that they use, all it does is prove that it's allowed when you think you're going to die. And we're not disputing that. To say that it's only if you think that something bad is going to happen to your limbs, or you're going to get a virus, or whatever the case, we agree with that as well, but there's nothing to say it's only allowed in this situation. So what we're left with is the ayah itself. It mentions if you're ill. So anything where you have an illness would fall under that. Then we have the end of the verse that restricts it a little bit, that if it's going to be a hardship. So if someone had a cold to the point where they were shivering, or say a fever, and they felt they were shivering, and it was becoming, it was going to make them, they felt like they were going to be hurt, just the feeling of the cold water on their skin because they're shivering and they have a fever, or they have a flu and it's difficult for them to take the water and put it on them because they have body aches and these types of things. Because they're sick, and because it's now a hardship for them to do so. This, Allahu Alam, is the strongest opinion, because it's really the only evidence that we have. So if we're going to come and restrict something like we talked about before, we need an evidence. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes something am or mutlaq, or he makes it general, we need something to restrict it, to make it khas or to make it to restrict it. So really, with the lack of anything like that, what we're left with is the first opinion, that someone is ill and it's a hardship in them doing so. They don't have to look into whether they're going to die or whether it's going to prolong their illness or make things worse. Wallahu alam. And inshallah we'll stop there. Next Tuesday we'll go into talking about, the author mentions, if you fear that you're going to go thirsty, and some other things related to when it's allowed. So we'll go into that, and then we'll start talking about what type of soil is needed for tayammum, as well as the actual ritual or how to perform tayammum. Wallahu alam.